However way you want to do it.
Okay. Okay, everyone, if I could ask you to quiet down, you can keep eating, but we're going to be starting momentarily as part of our new fabulous being on time on the web doctrine. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm the Institute's president, Adam Posen, and I'm delighted today to be hosting an event with Jonathan Haskel speaking. Jonathan is an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. Jonathan is going to be talking about why has inflation been so high, what's driving inflation, as he puts it in his slides, wages, profits, or energy prices. Obviously, this is the key topic in macroeconomics of the moment. Additionally, we're very fortunate to have Jonathan this particular week. For those of you who follow such things, the latest inflation data for the UK came out earlier this week. And contrary to some people's expectations, although I would not say contrary to my own, core inflation remained more persistent than had been forecast. More importantly, not just about chasing data, and Jonathan's going to give us a lot more depth than that. This is a turning point in the discussion of inflation causes and effects, more on causes. As many of you are aware, our colleague Olivier Blanchard and our colleague across the street, Ben Bernanke at Brookings, issued a paper earlier this week on their assessment of the various causes of US inflation. Another colleague of ours, Jason Furman, from Peterson, gave a discussion in which he pushed back a little bit at their interpretation. There is very fertile ground for discussing these issues. Karen Dinan, David Wilcox, and I are leading a new project just starting here at the Peterson Institute, gathering a variety of perspectives to do a postmortem on inflation. But I am thrilled to have Jonathan here to give us his take on these issues. I will also just say it's a very pivotal moment for the UK. Obviously, a lot has been going on with the UK and the UK economy the last few years, including the fiscal follies of last fall, including Brexit, including its exposure to energy shocks, and many other things. And the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee has arguably one of the most transparent and example-setting inflation targeting central banks has come under a great deal of scrutiny and pressure in this context. Yesterday, we had Rachel Reeves, the MP for Leeds West, and also the shadow chancellor of the Exchequer for the UK, talking not about inflation, not about monetary policy, but Labour's vision for a new economic course for the UK. So all these things coming together make us very fortunate to have Jonathan Haskel with us. Jonathan Haskel is CBE, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. He is an external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee and remains a professor of economics at Imperial College's Business School. From February 1st, 2016 through January of this year, he was a non-executive director of the UK Statistics Authority. He's taught at various universities, including Queen Mary, University of London, University of Bristol, and London Business School, and been a visiting professor at the notable business schools in the US of Tuck, Stern, and has also been a researcher at the Australian National University. Very notably, he and a co-author did a influential new book, I guess it's a few years old now, called Capitalism Without Capital, The Rise of the Intangible Economy, which I do recommend as a thought-provoking read, and I look forward to more thought-provoking insights from Jonathan today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam, for those very, very kind words. It's a pleasure to be here at the Peterson Institute, and we consume avidly the work that the Institute does. And you mentioned Olivier and Jason Furman and so forth. Those are key. This is all key kind of work that we're very pleased to, as I say, be avid consumers of. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to talk through the issues, as Adam said, about driving inflation. I think we are at quite a pivotal moment in the UK, and I'm happy to have been the second UK person in a week here at Peterson, the Shadow Chancellor, having been here yesterday. So let me push this button here and hope that the slides advance. I hope everybody can see those at home. I'm going to give you a summary slide straight up. The lunch here is particularly delicious, so all you have to do is look at this slide and you'll get all the idea, and then you can go back to the nice lunch. So let me summarize it in the following way. The fact of the matter is that inflation in Britain is too high. It's 8.7%. Core inflation is 6.8%. These numbers are just too large. If you're not familiar with the Bank of England's target, our target is 2%. So it's well above target. Now, we've got some alleged proximate causes. I'm going to call them proximate causes because, of course, there's a large group of people who'll tell you it's just the money supply. But just on terms of the proximate causes, two particular issues. One is energy prices. I'm going to be talking a lot about energy prices. It's a massive issue in Europe, and I'll show you some data on that and compared to the US in just a second, which I hope will familiarize you with that in case you're not familiar with that situation. And the other is what I've called profiteering. It's sometimes also called greedflation, and it refers to the idea that inflation is driven by firms pushing up prices more than would otherwise have been justified in some very broad sense. Again, I'd be fascinated to know from people in the room whether this resonates in the US, but in Europe, this is very salient. And there are, major influential figures who are talking about this profiteering, greedflation, as being a big contributor to the process of inflation. So, again, to summarize, my view on the UK data, I'm going to show you some UK data in a second, is that the contribution of business profits to domestically generated inflation, in my view, is small. So I think there's not much evidence in the data for this greedflation, profiteering kind of story. So that's one thing on the UK data. And having taken you through that, I'm going to say something about policy. And so again, let me tell you up front my policy conclusions. Firstly, I think it's very important for us at the bank to lean against the risk of inflation momentum. Secondly, as difficult as our economy's current conditions are, if inflation became embedded, that would be worse. And therefore, in my view, we cannot rule out future rate rises. So with that summary, let me get into what I'm going to say. So I'm going to give you a bit of background. I'm very grateful as a Brit to be invited over here. So let me straight away give you a bit of background to the British and the European situation. I'm going to try and show you some comparative data as well. So hopefully that will be of interest. Then I'm going to use national accounts data to talk about the inflation contributions of payments to capital, payments to labor, payments to energy. The good news is that I think some national accounts data is quite informative about what these various pressures are, and especially the greedflation. The bad news is I'm going to have to walk you through some national income accounting, which of course being a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, I love national income accounting. We all spend all of our time doing national income accounting, but I completely understand that that's not everybody's cup of tea. So I apologize in advance that I'm going to detain you with a bit of this, but I hope to try to make it as intuitive as possible. And then lastly, I'll end with some implications for monetary policy. So let me start then with a little bit of background. Apologies for this slightly busy slide. This is a slide taken from the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Report, which comes out every quarter. And this is at the heart of what it is we're trying to figure out. So this is inflation since 2020 for the UK on the left-hand side, the US in the middle panel, and the euro area on the right-hand side. And this is a sort of contributions, a kind of inflation components contribution, where the inflation contributions are broken out according to, you can see the legend at the top, energy is in sort of orangey, services is in sort of yellow, and purple is food and non-alcoholic beverages, and then other goods are in blue, aqua, cyan, turquoise, whatever that color is. Now, what can you see from this picture? So if you look at the left-hand side, the first thing is UK inflation seems to be higher than in other countries, right? So it's peaking at around 11%. That's higher, casting your eyes on the middle there, than the US, similar to the euro area. But in the euro area, inflation has come down a lot faster. Right? So inflation in the UK has been high, and it's coming down, as I just mentioned, rather less quickly. So you can see that it's falling in the euro area and it's falling in the UK from its peak, but it's falling more slowly in the UK. And in the paper, and sorry, I apologize, I should have said, there's a text of this speech being issued as well on the Bank of England's website. That should have come out immediately I started talking. So in the text of the speech and in the paper, I talk about some of the reasons for why this is. On the far right, let me just take you through some of these bullets here to say what's going on. Essentially, the point in the UK is that we have had a very high exposure to the natural gas price shock. I'll talk about the natural gas price shock. This is the energy price shock consequent on the war in Ukraine. And although gas is not actually a big driver of British energy, in fact, we've been pretty good in Britain, if I may say. It's not my area, but we've closed down basically all our coal-fired power stations. And we generate huge amounts of electricity from renewables, which is a fantastic thing to do. Unfortunately, as you know, the physics of electricity and energy generation is you need base load. And therefore, the marginal provider is gas. And so we're very exposed, natural gas. Sorry, I'm going to have to try to learn better American. When I say gas, I mean natural gas as opposed to gasoline. So apologies for all of that. So the marginal supplier is natural gas. And so we're very exposed in that region. And the second bullet point there is about regulation. We have a price cap regulation in the UK where the price of energy is capped. It's around a bit over £2,000 per, on average per household. And the regulation means that there are lags in the energy changes because the price cap is ratcheted every 3 months. So part of the reason why European inflation is falling faster is that our inflation, our price cap is not adjusted as quickly. And as an example, Adam talked in his kind introduction about the CPI figures, which came out just a moment ago, just yesterday. And the figure fell from 10.8 to 8.7. It was quite a big, arithmetically, that's a very big fall. And it's all due to the fact of the ratchet effect from these price changes. So that's the first point, just to give you a bit of a picture about what's happening to inflation. Now, I said I'd say something about natural gas prices. So this is a very familiar graph. We spent all of our time on the committee looking at this graph. Data for Europe and the UK, this is in euros per megawatt hour. So this is how much it costs you basically to buy your natural gas. And you can see in January 22, it was already quite high. It was lower in the summer. And then when the war in Ukraine came along, it peaked enormously, and then there was an enormous peak between July and October last year. You can see it's fallen down a very long way on the right-hand side there. I want to give you some sense, though, of how expensive gas is. And I think one way of doing it is, since natural gas is a rather, the unit of megawatts per hour is quite a difficult unit. We could do it, the unit of euros per megawatt hour is quite difficult. I could do it in terms of pounds per British thermal unit. That's the other way of measuring it. And I'm sure everybody in this room is very fond of that unit. But instead, let me convert it as a calorific equivalent into barrels of oil equivalent. The peak of the price there in terms of barrels of oil equivalent is $400. So it was as if oil had gone up to $400. That is very expensive. In the US, on that equivalent side, prices are lower. They went up, they started around 10, roughly 50 at the peak, and have come down to around 12. So again, to give you some sense of that, this has been a very severe price shock in Europe. Let me say something about the labor market. The labor market is very tight in the US. So let's start with a familiar diagram. This is the VU ratio, the vacancies unemployment ratio. Olivier Blanchard of this parish has, of course, written extensively on that. And you can see that the VU ratio fell precipitously in the pandemic in the US. Again, that's that sort of aqua line, and then has gone up enormously. Similarly in the UK. So the UK labour market is very tight as well. The ratio of vacancies to unemployment in the UK, you can see earlier last year, was above 1. That is to say, 1 vacancy for every unemployed person. And then there are some trends over on the right-hand side there. So I hope that gives you a bit of background of where we are in the UK, this buffeting from this high natural gas energy price shock, and at the same time, this very tight labour market. So this pincer movement has caught us and created, as a consequence, a lot of inflation. And I want then to talk then about the approximate inflation contributions to try to find our way through what some of the causes are. Right, so this is the national income accounting bit, so everybody can go and get dessert or fill up on coffee or whatever it might be, whilst I try and get you interested in all this stuff here. Apologies for equations. Let me talk you through what it says here. The great thing about GDP, which I've written PVV, is GDP has got it's some output, it's value added produced by the economy, and it's got to go to people. So it's either got to be paid to workers or it's got to be paid to capital. So WL are the payments, the wage to L workers, R is the payments to capital, K the amount of capital, and then there are taxes and subsidies one has to throw into the mix as well to convert things from those factor costs to the market prices. That's the first equation. And the second equation is a sort of dynamic version of that. And for those of you who are kind of not economists and not mathematicians, I've got some little commentary on each of the elements of that equation. And hopefully it will sort of follow a little bit intuitively from the flow definition, which I have at the very top. The change in the price of GDP is going to be unit labor costs. If unit labor costs go up, then GDP prices are going to go up. Unit capital costs, if the reward we're paying to capital goes up, then GDP is going to go up. And taxes and subsidies, if we paid out a load of subsidies, then that would be a kind of artificial inflation of value added. And so we've got to take that off. So what does all this describe? Now I'll get onto the bullet points here and try and say all this in words. You could think of GDP as being a bit like domestically generated inflation. So GDP is this sort of value added concept. It's how much the local economy, the American economy, British economy, whatever it might be, how much each country's economy is producing domestically. It depends, as I've said, on the bullet points there, on unit labor costs, unit capital costs, and taxes and subsidies. Normally, taxes and subsidies are a bit of a sort of detail, but we're going to have to do, the devil is in the detail, I'm afraid, in this case. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the UK, during the pandemic, we had an extensive furlough system. In a furlough system, what happened is workers were just all sent home. The firm carried on paying them, but the government gave the firm a subsidy to pay them. Okay, so the furlough is an example where there were lots of inactive workers, so they were producing very little value added, yet there were big subsidies being paid to pay for their wage. So we have to take off the subsidies to get the fact that value added was very low because all those workers were at home. More latterly, we've had an energy price cap, And we have subsidies there as well. So the producers have been unable to charge a high price, so their value added has been low, but they've received a big payment in terms of their subsidy. So again, I make no comment about whether these are good or a bad thing. This is just the accounts and how all this stuff will add up. Why are we doing all this stuff? If we're interested in profiteering and greedflation, we're interested in the second of those buckets on the equation there about unit capital costs. Because if R, that's the payments to capital, is somehow or other going up, other things being equal, then that's going to add to price inflation. So the next slide then, and again, this is all in the paper, says R. So since we've got the official accounts, these are national accounts on this, these are not made up numbers, these are measured by the official statistical authorities. What can these payments to capital, this RK, potentially tell us then about greedflation? And at this point, again, I'm afraid I have to walk you through a little bit of the detail, and then in a minute I'll show you the numbers. And the detail relates to what it is that payments to capital actually refer to in the national accounts. So let me go through this point by point. Capital payments are rewards to national accounts capital assets. So in order to know what we're measuring, whether we're measuring greedflation or something else, we need to know what capital assets are in the national accounts, and there are a number of them. The first is business capital. So businesses have planes, machines, vehicles, goodness knows what else. They earn a reward, and so part of K there is going to be business capital. Now, a couple of points about that. Capital, of course, needs to cover depreciation. This is a gross measure, and then a net after depreciation rate of return as well. So in thinking about the rewards that this is measuring for business capital, part of that is going to be about depreciation. We know depreciation varies. If companies have relatively short-lived assets, they depreciate very quickly, and there might have been a move to that, and therefore there might be more payments a bit for that reason. Second thing is, much of business capital, I should say, as an interest of mine, which Adam kindly referred to, is of course unmeasured intangible capital. So I've been to a number of conferences over the last couple of days here, and at every single conference and every single conversation, you have to mention ChatGPT. So Adam and colleagues, now is the moment where ChatGPT comes into the presentation. What do we mean in this context by ChatGPT? ChatGPT is a bit of capital in some sense. It's a very fast computer, and it's incredibly innovative software. Software is a bit of business capital. It's a bit of intangible business capital, whereas the computer is the tangible bit, but both those things are in K. So the payments to capital are going to be the payments that these companies are making who've got this brilliant invention of ChatGPT. Okay, that's the intangible bit. The other bits of capital is there's lots of government capital and not-for-profit capital, and we have to pay depreciation on that, roads and infrastructure and so forth. And the other bit, which is extremely annoying from a sort of interpretation point of view, is that capital in national accounts includes domestic housing. In Britain, this is called dwellings. I don't know whether, is dwellings a very British expression? I don't know whether it's, people are nodding. Forgive me, I don't know what the American National Income and Products Accounts equivalent is, and I should do. So dwellings are are domestic, are domestic housing, and that's an owner-occupied imputed rent. Okay, so the reason I'm going, and two more things. The other point about capital is that some people who are self-employed have got their own capital. So a window cleaner has got their own, ladders and vans and all that kind of thing. So part of payments to capital are payments to capital of the self-employed. That then leads to a tricky conceptual question, which is what is greedflation? If households are paying themselves more from on their dwellings, on their houses, that boosts RK, and in principle then that would boost value added. I'm not sure that's greedflation. I'm also not sure that depreciation, if we happen to, as I say, move to more highly depreciated assets, I'm not sure that's greedflation either. So I think when looking at these things, one has to be a bit careful in going inside these various measures. And the reason I say that is a lot of the European debate has looked at that RK term that I'm talking about and said, oh, that's been going up and therefore greedflation. And I think I'm just trying to make the kind of conceptual point that there are lots of elements to that RK, not all of which might necessarily correspond to greedflation. Or more accurately, if one wants to argue that it's greedflation, I think one needs to make another step to break out all the different elements. So what am I going to do? I promised I've been showing you the data, so now I'm going to do that. I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to show you some data for the UK. It turns out that in the UK, we can basically break down all those payments into all these individual payments here as well. So we're going to break down the capital payments in the way that I've just described to different constituents. I'll then show you some international data where it's more difficult to do that, and then I'll show you something about the CPI. Okay. So again, I apologize, this is a very, very busy slide, but and there's lots of discussion about this in the paper. But let me try and walk you through this and try to give you the main point behind all this. So on the left-hand side, this breaks down the inflation in GDP, so this is domestically generated inflation, between 2021 Q4 and 2022 Q4. 2021 Q4 is quite convenient in the UK because that was the end of the furlough scheme. We were just coming out of the pandemic at that time. It was the beginning, so it's the end of the furlough scheme. So it's kind of helpful because there are a lot of subsidies and taxes and so forth going out there as well. So you can see that between 2 Christmases ago and basically last Christmas, inflation is that black dot up there. It's around 7%. Okay, that's the black dot, of which unit capital costs, that's that whole big fat section of capital costs I've just been talking about, is about 3.4%, you know, maybe half of it. Unit labor costs about something similar, around 3.1%. And then there are lots of subsidies going on. The subsidies help bring energy prices down, so they pull things down. And then there's some other stuff about statistical discrepancies, which I won't go into. That's the left-hand side. The right-hand side then breaks out the unit capital costs into the constituents that I was just discussing. So if you look on the right-hand side, if we go to the bluish bit, the bluish bit is the dwellings bit. Okay, it's actually other things as well, but think of the bluish bit essentially being dwellings. The middle bit is that which is the yellowy bit is depreciation by companies, leaving finally the orange bit, which is the net operating surplus. In other words, this is business capital after payment for depreciation. And you can see that that is, it says on the slide there, contributing 1.3. So a small fraction, we think, of inflation. So this is the foundation behind the notion I was trying to say at the summary slide, that we don't think there's much evidence for greedflation. It is true, again, to emphasize that the unit capital costs bit is quite big, the whole of it. But if we get down to the bit which is conceivably correlated with markups and profiteering and all that kind of thing, that seems to be much smaller. Okay, so that's for the UK because we can do all those details. A couple more charts. Here is the cross-country data that I promised, with the UK on the left, with the US in the middle, and with the Euro area on the right. Again, I apologize for this busy slide, but because of data availability, we have to lump more things together, and there are slightly different things in some of these boxes here. Let's concentrate on the US for a second. So the contribution of unit labor costs is the blue, which is quite large. Not so big is unit capital costs, which is the orange. And then you've got the other contributions as well. In the UK, the contribution of capital costs looks a bit larger here. That's because there are some statistical issues which we've had to put in there. In Europe, it looks large as well. And that's part of the argument in Europe about greedflation. And we talk a lot in the paper about the measurement challenges that there are there. So let me go on then to say something about CPI inflation, because all of this has been value-added inflation. I'll walk you through this very quickly, and then I'll move to the monetary policy side. All of that was about value-added inflation, but after value-added inflation, that's not quite CPI inflation, because CPI inflation is more than just value-added. In Britain, for example, we import lots of goods, we import lots of energy. And so to do a decomposition in terms of CPI inflation, it's that equation there. And again, let me walk you through the headings rather than the specific terms, all of which is discussed in the paper. So what does it say? It says CPI inflation is due to wages, due to capital returns. Total factor productivity if that is steaming ahead, that takes away CPI inflation because costs are falling. Taxes less subsidies in the middle there, and on the far right is the new term with CPI, which is import prices net of export prices. So again, there's a lot of national income accounting underlying all of this. This is just basically an accounting identity. And this allows you then to talk not only about the greedflation bit, which is the capital returns we've just been discussing, subject to the various difficulties I said, but also about the contribution of imports and imported gas, which is very important in Europe. To give you a little bit of a sense of that, again, there are lots of complicated diagrams in the paper which go through all of this. Let me walk you through this a little bit. What this is the cumulative consumer price inflation from essentially the start of the pandemic to 2022 Q4, which is when we got the data from. So to give you, well, why don't we do the US, but be more familiar to people. So cumulatively, prices have gone up by about 12.5 percentage points. And then it breaks down the various contributions to that. Labor costs, you can see, are contributing quite a lot. Capital costs, not so much. Over in Europe, prices are up by about 15 percentage points, of which the capital cost is quite a large contribution relative to labor costs as well. Again, it turns out to be some complicated measurement kind of issues. And similar thing on the left-hand side as well. The only other thing I should say is that the sort of pink bars here are the terms of trade effects, that is to say the imported prices net of the exported prices. So they tell you something about the contribution from imported energy. You can see in the US, those have, if anything, been negative. The US has not been hit by so much of an energy price shock. In Europe, they've been very large. Over on the far right-hand side, again, that pink bar on the right-hand side there tells you that these terms of trade shocks have been very large. A little bit less in the UK, partly because in the UK we do produce and export some of our own energy. So our export prices have gone up a little bit relative to the import prices. Okay, thank you for bearing with me with all of that complicated national income accounting. Let me finish with the last couple of slides to say something about monetary policy, and then I promise I will stop. So one way of bringing all this together is to look at the labor share of income. So all these dynamics of wages going up and profits going down and up and all this, that, and the other. The labor share of national income is a way of summarizing all of this. Now, I know this is an issue of tremendous controversy in the US because it's been falling for a very long period of time. In Europe, things are, I don't know whether they're easier, but they're sort of easier from a statistical point of view because the labor share has basically been flat for about 30, 40 years. And you can see that here, the 2012 to 2019 average is that orange dotted line there. And the labor share has just been moving around that average. If you look on the axes, it's varied from about, 50, a bit below 59 to a bit below 60 to a little bit above 57. Not been varying all that much. The pandemic area is shaded on the far right there. You can see, if anything, the labor share went up a little bit. And since then, it's been coming down. Now, I should say the labor share is the share of GDP accounted for by payments to labor. These are all payments to all types of labor. So they include comprehensive payments, which includes bonuses. Turns out in the UK, bonuses are quite important. They go disproportionately to better paid labor. So if you went inside this labor share, you'd find that if anything, the better paid have done rather better than the lower paid. So even within these broad accounting categories, I think it's quite legitimate to then go inside them and ask what's happening to the different actors inside there. But if we sort of think about that and ask the question, what does that tell us about the outlook? Let me summarize with this and say this is my last slide. The key question from a monetary policy point of view is whether inflation is going to be embedded or not. Now, we've got lots of data and analysis from the 1970s. The classic book, which I'm very fond of, is by Michael Bruno and Jeff Sachs. And we've got lots of analysis of the labor market experience of the 1980s and 1990s. And I put up various names there. Again, I mentioned Olivier Blanchard of Peterson, who's very influential here. And you'll see the other names there. The issue, however, of course, is we haven't seen 1970s inflation since the 1970s. So the tricky question is, can we bring to bear that evidence base on our current policy making? Should we throw it away? Should we bring it to bear? Should we say everything's changed? What should we do? And the bank, I'm sure the Federal Reserve do the same here, rightly stress how uncertain all of this is. Now, does that mean we should just throw up our hands and say it's all terribly uncertain, there's nothing we can do? Let me make a couple of remarks about that. What are we going to do with so much uncertainty? Rather than throwing up our hands and saying it's all terribly difficult, I think it's better to do two particular things. The first is we want to monitor very closely the data, as much data as we can, on inflation persistence. And I've got a couple of issues there which we as a committee have said we think is important, and I add a couple of my own particular indicators. So the first is labour market tightness. Vacancies and hiring and firing expectations have the great advantage of being somewhat forward-looking indicators of the state of the labour market. After all, if I'm putting out a vacancy today, it's probably because I'm expecting, it's going to take time to fill that worker. So it's a somewhat forward-looking indicator of my expectations about the fact that I'll probably need the worker. So I may as well issue a vacancy today. Similarly, in the UK, there are quite a few surveys of hiring and firing expectations because of various legal issues in the UK, which I won't bore you with. If you want to get rid of a load of people from your company over a certain number in certain conditions, you have to notify people. They don't stop you from doing it, but you have to notify various agencies that you're going to do it. So those indications, again, are kind of interesting forward-looking indications, and be very interested in the discussion to learn more about whether there are similar indicators here. Secondly, inflation persistence measures. Adam in his introduction mentioned core inflation, services inflation, underlying persistence, and wage growth, and bank staff have developed a lot of interesting indicators there. My very last point, I'll just repeat what I said as a matter of policy. As I say, I prefer to lean against the risk of inflation momentum. If we've got uncertainty, let's be careful to lean against that. As difficult as the economy's current conditions are, if inflation were embedded, that would be worse. We don't want to have that. And as I mentioned before, further increases in bank rate, I think, cannot be ruled out. Thank you very much for your patience in going through all of that accounting, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just to reassure you, both our internal and our online audiences are almost geeky enough to enjoy your national accounts data.
Excellent.
No, we're all seriousness. We're very glad to have you here and addressing this now very popular issue of greedflation, but as well the topical aspects of the situation in the UK and in the US and Euro area. So before diving in more deeply on the conceptual analytical work you're doing, maybe you could expand a bit more on your reaction to the latest UK inflation data, which just came out. As you note, the headline fell quite a bit, but the core rose quite a bit. One doesn't want to make too much of 1 month's data, all that, but this does seem to suggest, at least possibly, the UK is sort of going on its own path, where as opposed to inflation moving sideways in the US and down in the Euro area.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And again, to repeat for colleagues here, that this change was just yesterday, so this is kind of hot off the news. And I think colleagues at the bank are just processing this news. Again, the headline rate fell substantially. Part of it, of course, a large part of it reflects these base effects. So, gosh, we're really into the teeth of the accounting and deep in the weeds here, which is to say that last April, I mentioned the regulated price cap. Energy prices in the UK went up 54%. 54%. That is a big increase in a very crucial part of people's cost of living. And now, that was a year ago, so that comparison has now dropped out of the annual comparison. So that contributes a lot to the fall. So it's very welcome, and we predicted that fall. What we didn't predict so much was the rise in core inflation. Again, Adam, as you mentioned, that is high, and it's higher than expected. Digging into that, much of that is goods, some of it is services, and much of the goods surprise is around second-hand cars. And I think the price of second-hand cars has been a puzzle here as well, actually. It's been gyrated, it's gone up and down.
It's been gyrating. I'm not sure it's a puzzle, but anyway.
Well, it's more of a puzzle for us in that case. Everybody here is completely on top of it by the sound of things. Now, the indicators of supply constraints and so forth in the car industry were very, back a year ago, and I know I've just been talking to colleagues who've been traveling to the Far East and all of that. There were shortages of chips and there were shortages of supply components and all that kind of thing. So the upward pressure on car prices looked easy to rationalize. Most of that we think has now gone away, actually. So there should be downward pressure on car prices. So I would hope that the car prices effect is somewhat of a blip. But we don't have, clear evidence on that, but I would hope it would be somewhat of a blip.
You also touched on in your remarks and your charts the relative tightness of the British labor market. There is a difference from the US, and worth noting that there seems to have been a major fall off in participation, possibly associated with COVID and health issues. How are you thinking about labor supply? Also, there's been a huge shift in the composition of migration. What is your thinking on how that's contributing to the inflation outlook?
Yeah, thanks. Adam, let me broaden the question out a little bit, if I may, because I think it's under the general heading of what has been the impact of the pandemic on, well, all economies, but the British economy in particular. And I must say, when the pandemic first struck, I've had the privilege to be on the committee for 4 years, so I was in the middle of it when the pandemic first struck. I think most of us were looking at a productivity consequence of the pandemic. And I think for most of us, the idea, what we were terribly worried about was kind of hysteresis in productivity. Workers and firms are matched together. There's lots of tacit knowledge, in that match. Relationships have been built up and all of that. You have a pandemic, everybody's got to work from home, lots of businesses, going out of business and all that kind of thing. You break up all of that match, you lose all of that match-specific capital. I think a lot of us worried enormously that there would be horrible productivity consequences from all of that. And actually, as it turns out, as at least in the UK, those productivity consequences don't seem to have been that serious. What's been much more serious, Adam, forgive me getting to your question, is the drop-off in activity. In other words, the rise in inactivity, the lowering of participation in the labour market. Participation is about 0.5 percentage point down in the UK now relative to pre-pandemic. And you might say, well, 0.5 percentage point, that's not very much. But of course, a small percentage point on a very large number, like the entire workforce of the UK, is a hell of a lot of people. And we've tried to get into the numbers to try to find out what mostly that's driven by. A lot of it seems to be driven by early retirement. Increasingly, though, a lot of it is driven by ill health and a big pile-up, I'm very sorry to say, of people who've suffered long-term health consequences from COVID. Now, whether that's because of long COVID, so it's particularly associated with COVID itself, or whether it's because people, of course, missed hospital appointments and had difficulty getting treatment and all that kind of thing, entirely understandably. Again, love to learn more about the US, but in the UK, the health system more or less closed down, again, entirely understandably, in order to prioritize vaccinations and for safety reasons. So whether it's because of the buildup of those issues, we're not quite sure. But that does seem to be a lasting feature of the pandemic. Now, the participation, let me call it the activity rate, has been rising slightly, actually, over the last few quarters. But it's been rising amongst students, which may not be a sustained increase. So we think that there might be some, as I say, the permanent consequences of the pandemic, that may well be one of them.
Thank you. Let me follow on that, Jonathan. I mean, obviously, you've been doing work, I shouldn't say obviously, you are well known for having done work on productivity issues before and during your time on the MPC. We just today got the latest numbers on GDP in the US.
Oh.
And depending which you believe, you could argue that the US has had basically GDP contraction near zero for 3 out of the last 4 quarters, which given the labor market seems a bit odd, but which would be consistent with terrible productivity growth. In the UK case, I remember when I was leaving the bank, the MPC in 2012, I'm old, both then Governor King and I were out there saying, you know, there hasn't been the financial crisis was not a supply shock to the UK. The productivity growth will come back up, and we were both wrong. Productivity growth, if anything, stalled worse and more persistently, if I can put it that way, in the UK than anybody else. So could you say a bit about what you think about long-term productivity trends for G7 overall, and specifically why the UK seems to be, even within that group, lagging?
Gosh, that's a very big question, but that in many ways I think is the key question. So let me have a go, but come back at me, Adam, if I'm wandering around too much and not getting to the answer. I think we know quite a lot about productivity over the immediate pandemic period, which is essentially, again, forgive me for talking about the UK.
No, please.
We closed down lots of the low productivity sectors. So the restaurant sector, you know, the hotel sector, things like that, as measured is low productivity sector. Those all closed down. So arithmetically, just by sheer averaging, we call it in the UK a batting average effect, because we're very fond of cricket, and naturally, all the bad batters are, you know, not coming into bat, so the average obviously must go up. So productivity went up enormously over the pandemic. Then, when we reopened all of those sectors, guess what? Productivity came back down again. So there was a burst of growth and then a fall. Now, the more interesting question, I think, is, and John Haltiwanger was talking about this at a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond I was just at earlier this week, is there has been a burst in America. This is Haltiwanger's data, and my colleague Sophie Piton has looked at this in the UK. There's been a burst of entry over the pandemic in America. And likewise, there's been a burst of entry of new firms over the pandemic in the UK. And so you might say, well, goodness me, aren't technological revolutions, AI, ChatGPT, and all that kind of thing, are they not, is not a precursor of those, a burst of new entry, new firms coming in, trying and having a go and all of that? So I think in terms of the long-term aspect of the pandemic, that's the kind of key question in front of us as to what that burst of new entry looks like. In the UK, that new entry is mostly in the online retailing sector. And interestingly, you can, there's a lag of about 10 weeks when you have low footfall in a retail establishment. Then 10 weeks later, you have a burst of online retailers who start. So these are single entrepreneur online retailers. And that's what most of the energy is. They are not creating, I have to say, at least the early indications, that many jobs. So it may not be this is a job-rich thing. But on the other hand, Amazon had to start somewhere, right? Microsoft had to, Google, they had to start somewhere. They started small somehow or other. Now, I am doubtful about whether this is the portent of some big revolution, but I think one should at least accept that, and one should at least accept there is a possibility there and look at those issues in the pandemic. That's one set of issues. Another quick set of issues, Adam, if I may, and then I'll stop. The work that I've done on productivity has been mostly around intangibles. And the intangibles idea is that the nature of the economy has changed. The economy used to invest in very tangible assets, buildings, vehicles, plant, and equipment. Now it's investing in software and design and movie scripts and creative stuff and all of that. With that, of course, then comes lots of possibilities for productivity built on those intangible assets. But we have to have the right conditions in place. So there have to be the right financing conditions for intangibles, which are rather difficult to do. And then there has to be the right sort of spillover mechanisms where some intangible ideas spill over to various other people as well. And I think the productivity problem is related to us managing as a society the transition from that more tangible economy to the intangible economy.
Thank you. If we could, I'd like to go back to the core of your speech and the paper, which is available on the Peterson Institute website, the Bank of England website.
Yep.
I encourage you to read it. And this notion of greedflation or profiteering, and as you rightly said, it's getting a lot of attention. It's become very popular. Your charts seem to show there ain't much there by the time you take out dwellings, residents, and so on. we've seen some of the advocates of this point of view saying recently, of course, it's not that greed varies over time, it's opportunistic, it's when you have a shortage, that's when these firms can go up. Um, without trying to make this too pointed, I mean, what is your response to that? Is there some way they could be right that wouldn't show up in the capital share of GDP or wouldn't show up in the decomposition of returns to capital you were talking about? Or are they just willfully missing some basic national accounting?
Let me give you a boring answer and then a slightly more interesting answer. So the boring answer is, from an accounting point of view, this is very difficult to do. These are often residual items. Measuring capital is fraught with risks and difficulties. There are lots of very talented statisticians sitting in statistical offices, be it here in America or be it in the UK or be it anywhere else, trying to figure out and grapple with all of these issues. So that's the boring answer, which is the measurement of this stuff is quite hard. And so there may be, a host of measurement.
Before you give the exciting answer, let me try to draw a little excitement out of your boring answer. You used to be, as mentioned, a non-executive director of the UK Statistics Agency. You're a genuine expert on this. How big a range of differing answers could you get out of measurement and definition legitimately? Like, could your 1.1 be 2.2, or could it be only 1.5?
That is a very good question. I'm going to hesitate and not put a number on it, but I think the answer to that is these could be quite wide intervals. Because, as I say, it is difficult to measure these different things. So, for example, as people know, there are lots of different ways of measuring GDP.
Right.
So just the single GDP itself, which we would hope would be consistent across the different ways of measuring, turns out to be very different, especially over the pandemic. It became very difficult to measure all of these things, leaving aside the conceptual kind of issues. And so there's quite a lot of variation just within those measures as well. So,
and that would apply to your measures of labor share as well.
It would. So I think that's a fair criticism. I think that's a fair criticism.
It wasn't as a criticism, it's just to have our audience understand whether people.
No, I think that's right. And again, I think, Adam, if I may, so it goes to a very important point, which is the central banks have got to work, in my opinion, very closely with the stats agencies to understand all of this. But the pandemic has made things very hard for the stats agencies. Response rates, I believe this is true in the US as well. Response rates are right down. People have moved all over the place. People are doing stuff online. So there are a whole set of challenges there as well, actually, which makes this more difficult. Yep.
Before you go to your more exciting answer, I just want to flag one of our Peterson Institute colleagues, David Wilcox, is, I believe, now chair of the Advisory Committee on Government Economic Statistics, and he's trying to wrestle with some of these issues. Please, so then you had a more non-measurement answer.
And they're first-order issues. The non-measurement answer is, just as there are lots of different kind of asset categories across that capital bucket, if I may call it that, there are lots of different industries there as well. So we do know that the oil and gas industry, for example, have had very high profits, as best we can measure them as well. So if one wanted to go to different industries, one could probably tell quite a different story on the different industries. Likewise, we also know that over the pandemic, some firms, online firms, for example, have done extraordinarily well, as people understandably have pivoted away from bricks and mortar shopping, for example, to online shopping and all that kind of thing. So just again, I think a lot of the discussion has often been examples of firm A and firm B and firm C in certain sectors. What we're doing here is a much more national accounts to see if there's a broader, to see what the evidence is on this broader set of measures as well. So I think that's part of the way of reconciling the two types of discussion that there are.
Right. So thank you. That's very helpful. So I think that tells us that the phenomenon of firms opportunistically facing shortages or various circumstances raising their profits might be very real, but it's not necessarily cumulatively a major piece of the overall inflation puzzle.
Indeed, and I don't want to minimize how salient this is for people.
Right.
If they are shopping in a particular place and that retailer is raising their markups, if they are buying their gasoline at a particular place and that retailer, or their natural gas or whatever it might be, that's incredibly salient for people. And like I said, I absolutely don't want to minimize that at all, because that is causing people a lot of stress and a lot of worry. As I say, we're much more kind of macro, much more broader to look at the general trend.
Let me now take you back towards the issue of monetary policy, which you ended your presentation with. In the US, there was a story that myself, Jason, Olivier, others in this building told, that part of the reason we got the inflation we did in the US was that Fed was slow to react, and there was a fiscal stimulus, a large accumulation of fiscal stimulus at the end of 2020 and early 2021, and the Fed also didn't react to that. And the Bernanke-Blanchard paper addresses some of this. In the UK, there was nothing on the order of that magnitude of that. Sorry, nothing on that order of magnitude in terms of fiscal stimulus.
Indeed.
And the inflation seemed to come a little later in the UK, just as in Europe, arguably spiked by not reopening, but by the Russian barbaric invasion of Ukraine. So I guess two questions. First, does the fact that we've all ended up with roughly large amounts of inflation at roughly the same time say this is the wrong way to look at it, that there's some global force that energy really is the main factor or whatever it is? And secondly, is an implication of this that you feel that the Bank of England was in no way behind the curve?
Thanks, Adam, for those questions. On the global force, I think there is undoubtedly a global force, just as you've said. As we saw in the graphs earlier on, the energy price, the natural gas price, has been the experience has been different across countries. High in Europe, rather less here. But the goods prices, goods are internationally traded and all of that, and goods prices are doing a lot of work in boosting inflation, and that's been, I think, a common experience across lots of different countries. One might even say that the high fiscal stimulus here in the US, which pushed up goods prices, had a spillover effect of pushing up goods prices elsewhere. Obviously good for the goods producers, but not so much for the importing consumers. That's the first point. On the second point about being behind the curve, thank you for putting the question so politely, Adam. Many people put the question much more critically towards us, and I'm going to be, I hope similarly polite, but I'm going to push back very hard against all of that, because I do not think the Bank of England were behind the curve, and let me say why, if I may. So for us, because as you pointed out in the question, Adam, we didn't have the fiscal stimulus. Inflation started taking off for us in the summer of 2021. And that's pretty closely correlated with the rise in natural gas prices. It wasn't on that graph, I apologize, that graph started in January 2022. We'll get the data going back, and happy to circulate all of that. We didn't know, obviously, about the war in Ukraine, but in hindsight, what was going on is that as a presage to the war, the Russians were cutting off gas, and this is all well documented. And therefore, as I said, natural gas prices was going up. So inflation started to go up then. However, we were still operating the furlough scheme in the UK at that time. The furlough scheme ended in October 2021.
Just to translate British to American English, the furlough scheme was the British version of what was also on the continent of keeping people tied to their jobs.
Right.
Through government subsidies, rather than the US format of having people be discharged into unemployment to get benefits. Sorry.
No, Adam, thank you for saying that. And 2 weeks before the furlough scheme ended, there were 1 million people on the furlough scheme. So it's true that inflation had started to creep up over the summer, but as I say, in the September, October, there were still 1 million people on the furlough scheme. Now, we didn't know what was going to happen to those 1 million. 1 million people is a lot of people. We didn't know what was going to happen to them. It was perfectly possible that the labor market would have been unable to absorb them. There were no jobs for them to do, in which case we'd have 1 million extra people unemployed. That would be obviously a terrible situation. As it turned out, they were mostly absorbed by the labor market. The labor market was more robust than we thought, but we didn't know that. So that's point number one about why we did not raise rates in sort of September, October. Then, and again, I'm sorry to take this trip down memory lane, but people have sort of, we were talking about it at the table earlier on, people have kind of forgotten about the pandemic situation, in particular about Omicron. And we got briefings from the chief medical officer in the UK about Omicron. And I remember when it first came in sort of September, October last year, at least in the UK, I remember asking the chief medical officer, so what happens if Omicron gets past the vaccine? What are we going to do? And his answer was, we have to start all over again. We have to re-engineer the vaccine, which through the mRNA technology is now rather easier to do, but we have to start all over again. So we were facing that uncertainty as well about the possibility of the Omicron virus, going around the vaccine. Now, again, as it turned out, the vaccine was robust enough in the face of Omicron for that not to be the case. But we just didn't know at that time. And so when we finally did raise rates, which was in November, December, if I remember correctly, of 21, although that was a way past the initial increase in inflation, as I say, which had come in the summer, my very strong argument is that we were not behind the curve because we don't have the benefit of hindsight. We were making policy in real time and reacting to those kind of conditions.
Thank you very much. Let me open it up to our live audience. If anyone would care to ask a question, we will bring you the microphone, I believe. Please, yeah, there. If you could identify yourself and your affiliation before asking a question.
Hi, thank you so much for visiting. I'm Asher. I'm an analyst here at the Peterson Institute. And I'd like to hear more about the inflation story broken down by regions. There's a lot of the classic stories that the southeast of England has done much better than the rest of the country. And I was wondering if you've done any analysis on that front.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. That's a really interesting question. Our target is a 2% target, as I mentioned earlier on, is a national target. So we don't differentiate between the different regions because that would be not our remit. Weirdly, we don't have that much region-specific data on prices. There's regional house price data, which is important, but otherwise the regional data is a little bit more, from the price basis, a bit more difficult to get. People consume different baskets of goods across the different regions. So we are probably not as well informed on that as we should be. And again, I'd be fascinated to know what techniques are being used here to improve that, here in America, to improve that. But I think part of the reason for that, as I say, is that because we go for the national inflation target, we don't tend to look at that. Back to the salience issue, I think the most salient feature of that is house prices, which vary enormously across different regions. Very expensive in London, fairly obviously, much cheaper in other regions. And those dynamics of house prices have been quite different across the region.
Well, also presumably wage inflation is somewhat different across regions.
Yeah, but of course that's also related to the composition of the different types of workers as well. So unraveling all of that is an important job of work.
Thank you. Is anyone else? There, please, and then there.
Hi, I'm Stephen Kamen from the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you very much for that very clear and interesting presentation. I wanted to ask whether identifying particular categories of national income that have risen much, like be it capital or labor, is the same thing as identifying the underlying drivers of the inflationary surge that we've seen in the last couple of years. Now, I'm more familiar with the US data. So in the United States, real wages have been approximately flat since the beginning of the pandemic. Whereas interestingly, if you look at the labor share of income as calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's actually risen. So there seems to be a bit of a disjunction there. And in any event, you could imagine that even if one sector's share has risen, I mean, that if it's a particularly large sector like labor, that might not be where the initial impetus for the inflationary surge had developed. So I wonder if I'd get your views on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Stephen. I mentioned this a tiny bit in the slides, and we do talk about this in the paper. I think of this as being a discussion of the kind of proximate causes. The ultimate causes would require another speech, essentially, because there one would want to have a behavioral model of wage setting and price setting and so forth. And Olivier Blanchard and Ben Bernanke, in their paper, I believe, go in some direction to do all of that. Now, various macro models, which we have at the bank, have got some of these features in them, and other people have built all these various models as well. We didn't want to go down that route just for the purposes of this paper, because I think we wanted to just, with all the difficulties which have been pointed out, just look at the accounts and just look at the numbers rather than simulate the models and so forth to see what was going on. But I think it's an important next step to look at, as you're pointing out, the behavioral drivers behind all of this.
Thank you. For our last question, Pedro, Mary, if you can hand him the mic.
Thank you so much. Pedro da Costa with M&I. You mentioned that you can't rule out another interest rate hike. The market seems to be well ahead of you, already pricing in another 100 basis points. What's your view of market pricing? And along the same veins, in the Fed system, there was a discussion about sufficiently restrictive. I was wondering where the debate lies within the BOE and what your views are on that.
Yeah, Pedro, thanks for the question. All I'm going to say is we can't rule further rates out. I'm not going to comment on the market curve or anything like that. I'm just going to repeat, if I may, what we say in the speech and what we've said as a committee as a whole, which is that we're monitoring very closely the inflation persistence. That's the key thing that we're looking at. That's part of the reason why I wanted to be a little bit forensic and go through the various elements of used cars and all that kind of thing. So we're looking at inflation persistence. I've tried to be open as well about the kind of indicators that we're looking at: tight labor markets, the VU ratio, service sector prices, and all that kind of thing. And if we do see evidence of more persistence, we've said, and we've been very upfront about it, that more tightening is going to be needed.
Thank you very much. A deep thanks to Professor Jonathan Haskel, external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, for taking us through his take on one of the core issues of the day, the sources or the drivers of inflation, how much is greedflation, and some insights into the UK economic outlook. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.